Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. There are few people in the world who have done more to stand up to Silicon Valley than Margrethe Vestager. For over a decade, she's been the voice, and in many ways the leader, of the EU's attempt to regulate big tech. As the EU's competition commissioner, she's waged landmark legal battles against companies like Apple, Meta, and Google. And now, with her tenure approaching its end, Vestager has turned her attention to AI. The EU's AI Act is the first and so far most ambitious major piece of AI legislation in the world. Under the Act, certain types of AI systems, like those that are designed to be manipulative, are banned outright, while other AI companies will be required to conduct risk assessments and make sure their datasets aren't biased. All of this is coming at a moment when the need for safeguards has never been clearer. A recent study from the University of Washington found that 3 top AI hiring tools discriminated against both women and Black people. An explosion of deepfakes has led to a surge in identity fraud and other cybercrime. And there have been allegations that AI chatbots have persuaded users to take their own lives. All of which is to say, the harms of this technology are no longer hypothetical. Here in Canada, our own AI legislation is in a perilous place and increasingly looks like it might not pass at all. So I wanted to talk to Commissioner Vestager about how the EU is trying to keep its citizens safe from AI and whether time is running out for us to do the same thing here. Commissioner Vestager, welcome to Machines Like Us. It really is an honor to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with the urgency or the perceived urgency for governing AI right now. What about AI demands governance now? What makes you nervous about this technology as it gets rolled out globally?
Well, actually, it's something quite simple, which is that we want people to be seen as who they are and that they can trust technology to see them as who they are. Because when you get into or want to get into university, there will be an algorithm sorting through the applications. When you're applying for a mortgage, it will be an algorithm that will go through your numbers. When you dial 911, there will be an algorithm helping the person to decide whether or not they should send an ambulance. So, in situations where your life may take quite a turn, you need to be able to trust that the technology that helps humans take good decisions can be trusted.
You say algorithm. I mean, in some ways, many of those decisions have been mediated by technology before. What's different about AI algorithms now?
Well, the AI algorithm is more like an agent, where previous technology was kind of stupid. It would do its drill, but it could not sort of say, well, based on that, you should go that way instead of that other way. So it has much more, of course, not human agency, goes without saying, but it has much more potential to influence decisions than old technology.
Yeah. So the EUA Act looks at these AI algorithms or these AI systems, and it flags unacceptable risks. How do you define an unacceptable risk?
So a lot of risks are completely, we wouldn't deal with that. We don't touch research. We don't touch innovation. You just go, go, go.
Yeah.
If you want to have a chatbot doing your customer service, well, tell people that it's machine. Otherwise, we don't care.
Do you have to in the EU? Do you have to identify an AI?
You have to identify this as a machine.
Yeah.
If I get a music recommendation in my streaming service that I don't like, I can do something else.
Yeah.
It's obvious to me. So we identify high risk where the AI Act kicks in as something where, there is a risk that you will be discriminated.
Is that the focus of the risk? Is discrimination? Is that the core, or are there others that are?
Well, you could say that it is a way of expressing that human rights should be respected. But discrimination is the most obvious one. We had a scandal already. I think it was the Dutch government using AI to distribute child benefits. And it tended to do so based on postal code. And that doesn't really have anything to do about your needs when it comes to child benefits.
Right.
So I think everybody realizes that here you really need to be able to trust the algorithm. So it is, I think, quite obvious that care needs to be taken before you deploy technology in these essential situations.
This is all moving very fast. I mean, I think, and there's this paradox that often gets, I assume, repeated back to you ad nauseum, that we're in this kind of race, and how can governments keep up with the pace of technological change? How do you think about the evolution of this technology and the imposition of regulations and governance that's slow and cumbersome in many ways by design?
Well, first, we do not really regulate technology. We regulate the use of technology. And this is a very important distinction, because if we were regulating technology, this legislation would be outdated before it was even fully in force.
Right. It started before ChatGPT, for example, right?
We started work before that. So it's the use of technology that we are looking at. We even have something that is prohibited, like doing social scoring or blanket surveillance in public space based on AI, or embed AI in toys that can make children do something that they shouldn't do. Second perspective is indeed that there is a race. The problem with the race is that you're thinking about how to get around the next corner in the fastest possible way in order to get over the finishing line first. So you do not think about long-term perspectives because it's here and now, because the race is on. And I think it's important that as a society, we take upon ourselves to have that long-term perspective, because we cannot expect of people who are in a race to do that.
How do you switch your? It's so natural to go to examples of harms, examples of technology. Like citizens need that in a way. They need to see that there's a need for governance, I think, and that often draws you into these conversations about what the technology does now or what it might be able to do. How do you keep a focus on these systemic risks or safeguards that could protect in the future from unknown risks? And how do you communicate that to the public?
I think it's really important that we take upon us the responsibility to have a systemic answer to something that is systemic. And it will be systemic. If you cannot trust the algorithm, well, then our society will look very, very different in 5-10 years from now. So it is important that people can trust us to do that. We can give examples, but we cannot, know everything by now. So this is why our approach is to say, well, listen, if we're not thorough now, well, then the UN Charter of Human Rights may not be relevant in 20 years because we have let it go, because we were not careful.
How does something like the emergence of agents fit in this framework? So it seems like there's something, agents seem like AI agents where they really are behaving on their own volition out in the world in many ways, really don't fit into the way we think about technology as something that can be controlled through regulation and risk assessments and these sorts of things. So this example of this Belgian citizen that was convinced or manipulated to take their own life by an AI agent. And so how do you think about something like that, like something that's deployed out in the world for whatever reason, if there's ever incentives embedded in it, that does something in the future that's highly damaging? Does that get caught in a risk assessment of the technology? You know what I mean? Like there's a real disconnect when something's out in the world and then does something bad in the future. How do you protect against that?
But the AI Act is not the solution to everything. It has a specific focus on a few things that are prohibited and the use cases that we consider high risk, where you have obligation to mitigate those risks. But we're so not done. Also because we see actors out there who are very laissez-faire or doesn't care at all about guardrails. So already today, you have AI that will enable you to do a fertilizer bomb. It will give you the recipe. You have AI that is highly manipulative, where there's no one who have said these things you cannot do. So it's not just for Europe. It is for the world to set the rules, to discuss them. So it's good news that United Nations are getting started. It is good news that different jurisdictions are moving in on this question. But it's not done with codes of conduct alone and voluntary commitments. You need laws and you need to enforce them. If I should give you one example, so we have something in Europe called the Digital Services Act, which is looking at digital services if they are safe to use. Before we started that process to get to this piece of legislation, we had first one code of conduct, everybody signed up to it. Then we had a second strengthened code of conduct, everybody signed up to it. Did we see result? No, we did not. So, I think it's completely justified that we take the step to regulate, because the voluntary commitments will only take you so far.
Well, when X left the voluntary code for disinformation, right? I mean, that
Exactly.
because it was voluntary. So
Yes.
they could voluntarily exit as
Yes.
well. You mentioned the DSA, and I mean, I think one of the real lessons to the world that you've provided and Europe has provided is that this combination of content policy for the DSA, competition policy through the Digital Markets Act, and data privacy through GDPR could work together, right, to
Yes.
govern the digital economy. Why do you need to add an extra piece of that to AI? What is it about AI that's different than all the other technologies you were trying to regulate before?
So AI will also be caught by the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. But AI is special in that it is a technology that to an increasing degree can do its own thing. And this is why when you deploy it, you need to figure out what kind of society do you want to be. And we pride ourselves with having public sectors that delivers education, infrastructure, health, a society driven by innovation, and an inclusive society where people can feel at home. If you want to remain like that, you need to know that the technology that serves you to enable that can be trusted. And this is why we need a specific piece of AI
In addition
legislation,
to these other,
in
yeah.
addition to the
Yeah.
other things.
Okay. You're also the competition commissioner, the commissioner of competition.
Yes.
And one of the narratives being promoted around AI is that this technology is going to lead to all sorts of economic growth, potentially exponential economic growth. How do you view the potential of the technology to spur economic growth, to spur innovation, to grow the European economy, and the need to protect against the downside risks of it? Do you see a tension there, or is this something that can coexist?
I think if we can get in control of the downside risks, we will have many more of the possibilities actually materialize. Because it's all about trust. Can you trust the technology actually to help you do what you want to do? Or would there always be something that, oh my God, it did something that it was not supposed to do? So I see our efforts to say, listen, when you have these use cases where there is a risk, take care of those risks, and then you go. Because I think there are huge potential. For instance, when it comes to the discovery of drugs for rare diseases, we can model weather and climate to a completely different degree than what we could before, in order both to better fight climate change, but also to cater for that so much more wilder weather that we're getting. So there will, numerous good use cases for AI.
So there's a recent report by former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi called The Future of European Competitiveness, where he argued that European companies are hindered at every stage by restrictive regulations. How is that debate playing out in Europe between the business case or the free market case for quick growth into the AI sector and the need to protect against those risks? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think once there was a slogan, move fast and break things, very often it's not things, but humans that you break. And this is not who we are. So for many, many decades, we have put in place legislation to protect children from child labor, to protect workers from getting cancer, from the environment being polluted, in order to create a marketplace where you do not compete against one another at the cost of your workers, children, the planet's now climate. For me, that is 100% legitimate because that is what society is about. And that has made Europe, I think, one of the best places to live ever on this planet, and especially if you're a woman. And if we want to continue that, and I think it's an amazing model, well, then we should cater for that model because it has served us well.
Even if it comes at the cost of some degree of GDP growth or rapid scaling of a sector.
But it still remains to be seen if that model is over. I think that we would be really lousy Chinese if we tried.
What do you mean by that? Explain that a bit.
Well, it's a different system. They don't care so much about the individual. You have a completely different sense of state control. I also do not think that we would be great Americans. And I think it's important to say, well, we have a culture, we have a way of doing things. We should develop it, we should challenge it, but we should also be loyal to what brought us so far. So I think it's really important to figure out, have we been too heavy-handed in some instances, but to remain loyal to what has made us European.
You mentioned Europe being very different than both China and America. There is a narrative emerging that we're getting three big blocks around AI, for example. We could get a European kind of regulatory model, an American, more free market version of AI that's much less restricted, and a Chinese one that is largely state-controlled. Do you see those blocks emerging, and do you think about that when you're creating rules for Europe?
Yeah, but I don't think that it really serves us to make that kind of not that you're doing that sort of simplified approach. Because
in fairness, I was doing that, so you can call that out.
But anyway, because there's so much more to it everywhere you go. And I think because we all sort of woke up to the reality of really potent artificial intelligence at the same time, the world has a completely different chance to make it together than what we had with sort of the first chapter of huge digitization, where the Americans provided a single market, simplicity in languages, and a lot of capital. And because of that, the rest of us, we're basically latecomers to that development.
And we absorbed their platforms and their technologies and then caught up later with regulations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to AI, well, it may be that it's primarily US companies, but the effects of AI, they are universal. Everybody feels it. And the second thing is that it is not only a three-polar world. India plays a huge role. A lot of African countries also moving into digitization of their economies really, really fast. So it's really important for me to see the world not as poles that are separate from one another and compete, but jurisdictions that are in a network that develops in order to figure out how to do things.
When you speak to American leaders, Chinese leaders, do you see a willingness to come together on some of these baseline risk mitigation strategies or governance approaches? Like, is that a reasonable path here, or should we be working in our own countries and own communities first and then coming together?
Well, the Chinese are different. Some of the prohibitions that we have in the European AI Act are inspired by what they do in China,
right,
that we have then prohibited in Europe.
We've seen the risks, and
we've seen the risks, and now we say, we don't want to go that way.
Yeah. And what happens if they keep barreling forward down some of those paths?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that gives a hint of optimism is that within the framework of the UN, first the US and now China have led the work to do AI-focused resolutions. And of course, one can say, okay, it's the UN, it's not a law, they cannot enforce it. No, but it changes perception. You know, when the world work together, get a common language as to what it is that we are seeing, what it is that we want to achieve. If you have a common language, then you can talk about things. And these are very important steps.
What's that common language for AI?
Well, I think it's very much a common language that realizes that there is huge potential, but there are risks that need to be catered for. I tend to think that if you're in control of the essential risks for the individual, that you're not being discriminated when you want to have a mortgage in order to buy a house or to get an education or to get a job, then the likelihood that the machine will turn against us is much smaller because humankind is everybody, every individual. And if individuals are treated in their own rights, well, then humankind has a much better chance of actually making sure that technology serves it well.
I wonder if there's a challenge with, as you say, the Chinese state desire to use AI as a tool of either collective behavioral control or direct control from the state, and the agency of an agent. I wonder if it could actually work, like AI could actually empower people against collectives, right? If it's not.
Well, at least what I've picked up from the Chinese side is that they're kind of skeptic towards AI because they don't like the idea of black box.
Exactly. They can't control this thing.
No, they don't. They don't like things where they don't know what is ongoing.
Yeah.
Which is for different reasons. One of the reasons why we are sort of, in some instances, on the same side.
That's incredible. That's actually a point of convergence for very different reasons.
For very different reasons.
Right. That's very interesting. So I want to turn from governments to the companies themselves. How have the tech companies, I mean, in many cases, these are the same tech companies who you've been dealing with for a decade in all these other regulations we mentioned. How have they responded to this addition to your attempts to step into the AI governance space?
Well, they're different. We talk about
the companies are different.
Yeah, the companies are different. We talk about big tech as one thing, but they have very different cultures. They have different approaches. They also have different business models. Microsoft and Apple are not the same. Apple and Google are not the same.
Oh, right, different from each other.
They're different they're also different in their approach to law enforcement. If you look at the AI companies, X is very, very different from Anthropic. Very different.
I mean, in many, many ways.
In so many ways.
Yeah.
They both develop AI. X have made the choice not to have guardrails for their AI agent.
Very explicitly. I mean, that's a marketing strategy almost. It's a marketing strategy. It's a differentiation for their product. Yeah.
Anthropic, the complete opposite. Their idea is that they will develop AI that you can fully trust. So you see everything.
Will X or Grok or whatever the AI company is, will they comply with the AI Act, do you think?
Well, that remains to be seen where they are at that time. I don't know the size of Grok because the AI has a specific chapter for general purpose AI. I don't think that many people will use Grok in high risk situations. So they will more likely be caught, for instance, by the Digital Services Act, which has this obligation, if you're a very large online service provider, that you do a risk assessment. Can my services be misused to undermine democracy, question election integrity, be damaging for people's mental health? And in that, of course, you also have to evaluate what happens when I embed powerful AI with no guardrails in my services.
In my social network,
yes.
Yeah. So Sam Altman, when the AI Act was being developed, sort of threatened to leave Europe, which is not a common tactic, right? Which is in response to the negotiation over regulation, companies often threaten to leave the market entirely. How seriously do we take those threats?
Well, they're obviously not politicians, because the first thing you learn as a politician is always threaten to stay. That is the only real threat that you have. Because when you threaten to leave, people will shrug their shoulders because someone else will take your seat.
That's interesting.
And now people say, oh, what do you think? Apple will not launch their AI in Europe as fast as in the US because of privacy. So I say, well, who has got a problem here? That is the intention, that people are protected. If a company will not protect you, well, that is their business decision, that they will not launch in a jurisdiction where we take care about people not being exploited with their data. I think that the Americans should have second thoughts, but we would never ask the same question if we said, oh my God, you prevented that this toy with lead was not launched in Europe. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, what do you think?
Because we don't want toys with lead. Therefore,
we don't want
that
toys
is an
that
act
are
of
toxic.
compliance with our
Exactly.
regulation. What are some things that tech companies have said they absolutely couldn't do, but when you impose the regulation, or when the regulation came into effect, they actually could do? Because that's a line we often hear, right? If you do this thing, it's technically impossible, or it will lead to us leaving your market, or whatever it might be. But the example of there seem to be cases where they've said that, and then they still comply. Or what are some things that they said they absolutely wouldn't do or couldn't technically do, but then did?
Well, the first thing is that by now they say we really need regulation. And then we say fine.
They say smart regulation.
And then we regulate. And then it turns out it was not the kind of regulation they were thinking about. Then they say, as you say, we cannot do this. Turns out they can do this. Facebook can find nudity wherever on their entire platform because they don't like nudity, which has been a huge problem in my country because we don't care
about nudity on the platform.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, of course, if it's abusive, it's a completely different thing. But otherwise, you can be naked. So this idea that there are things that they cannot find is complete nonsense. Yeah, sometimes it may take hours and hours and hours of engineering.
And money and resources.
To do it, yes. But, with market power comes consequences and responsibility.
Yeah.
So there can be no surprises here.
When Canada, the Online News Act came into effect, Meta banned news in Canada. So for the past year, Canadians can't see journalism on Instagram and Facebook. And that's had real consequence. I think costs to our democracy. When they do follow through with these things, should the government have taken that risk into greater consideration?
But you cannot bow to this kind of threats.
Even if the cost is we don't have journalism, we have less journalism in our democracy.
Even if so, because time passes and then you get another habit. Before you had Facebook and Instagram, we had great, lively democracies. And
perhaps livelier, you never know.
Maybe even livelier. So we will develop other habits. We will develop new ways of getting our news. It may be better, remains to be seen. But I don't think that we should accept that sort of the status quo is the best and should be preserved at all cost, because the government and the parliament had good reasons. Because news outlets were not respected for the work they were doing. If you do not pay journalists, they cannot do journalism. Full stop. So I think it was completely legitimate, and there were new ways will be found to get news to people and for people to find their news.
Do you see, how does journalism fit into this ecosystem in Europe right now? Is it so in the ways that generative AI platforms are using journalism? Does that come into the Copyright Act? Does that get caught in the AI Act in any way? Like, how do you protect journalism in a world where AI is replacing it?
I think this is a very good example of, being loyal to who you are. Because in Europe, you cannot just destroy other people's copyright. You need to respect copyright when you develop AI. Because copyright is something that enables journalists, musicians, artists, authors to work. And you cannot promote one sector that produces AI by undermining other sectors. That would be really, really stupid and short-sighted.
I mean, that's really happening in us.
And that is what is happening, especially in the US.
Yeah.
And we don't want that, because we need creation in our society. Also because some news outlets, they replace journalists with an AI algorithm. Sometimes an AI-written story is being checked. My guess is sometimes not.
And it might be generated on the base of other journalism that came before it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of discussions that we have not finalized yet, because you cannot do without journalism. If there's no journalism, if there are no independent news, you do not have, the second check of government. Of course, Parliament is the first check, but you don't have that second check of governments and on power and corruption in your society.
It can be hard for people to contextualize, I think, and ground these regulatory conversations around all tech policy, but particularly around AI. And as you know, our AI Act is in a precarious moment in Canada. It may be cut from our privacy bill. The privacy bill may not even be passed. How would you describe the urgency to Canadians to do this?
Well, I was surprised to learn this because I thought that Canada would be, a fast second. Europe first and then Canada setting its mark.
We pretty prefer to be a fourth or fifth mover in Canada.
Yeah, but here, thought through, well prepared, essential. So I think it's really important to move ahead. In Europe, it was never sort of a devising issue. Everybody came on board to say, well, this is important. And for me, that's a very important approach to have, that this is not something that will favor one party or another party. This is basically addressing what I think is quite fundamental in a society, that citizens should be able to rely on their politicians to make sure that they systemically are protected in order to be able to live their lives in full with all the freedoms that comes with feeling safe, also when it comes to the use of technology.
What happens if we fail to regulate AI quickly and seriously?
I think we take a huge risk of undermining what has built great societies. Because it's quite simple what we are trying to do. It is to say that when AI is being used, you should not be discriminated. You should be seen as who you are, asking for a mortgage with your symptoms when you go to the doctor. And I think everybody takes this for granted. And if we fail to make sure that you can trust that this is still the case, I think with willingly or because we're busy doing other things, we undermine the fundamentals of our democracy and our society.
Just to conclude, how much time do you think we have to get the AI governance right here?
Very little time. Because it's about creating a culture of compliance, and the more jurisdictions who say, we admire you signing up for the voluntary commitments, but we just want to tighten the screw a bit to make sure that when things are critical for the individual, that we actually have laws that apply.
Well, look, thank you for talking this through with me. Thank you for everything you've done over the last decade in this space. I mean, it really is remarkable for people who are working in this space and watching it to have Europe sort of years ahead of us on this. It's created a path, I think, for other countries that may do things a bit differently, but we can learn from what's happened in Europe. And that's a tremendous asset we have in countries that are a little slower to these conversations than you.
But I think the work done here is really great. And the point is not to copy one another. We can inspire one another. We can learn from each other. We can encourage one another. But there are room for differences because everything has a context. And our societies have these differences that may be subtle but important.
And we need to protect those differences in a world of global tech platforms.
Exactly.
It becomes even more important in some ways.
And this is why I think the sense of urgency is really important. I admire what has been done here. I really hope that it can be ended positively, both privacy and AI and the Harms Act, because these are fundamental pieces of legislation for a modern democracy.
Well, thank you.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Trish Kozika. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Our senior producer is Mitchell Stewart. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. The president of Paradigms is James Millward. Special thanks to Catherine Gretzinger, Matt Frainer, and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show out to as many people as possible.